Come, boy, it's only a film. Come. Pull yourself together. Have a few dollars, eh? That'll get your head up. Come on, money.
There's a hidden truth about John Lennon that many fans don't know. While he remains one of the most celebrated figures in rock history, not everyone admired him. In fact, some of the biggest names in music openly disliked him, and a few even made sure the world knew it. From clashing personalities to political divides, Lennon's outspoken nature often made him enemies. Among them was none other than Elvis Presley. Elvis and Lennon were two giants of 20th century music, but their single meeting was anything but warm. The king of rock and roll held a strong dislike for the Beatles, a resentment that only deepened over time. What should have been a legendary encounter in 1965, when the Beatles visited Presley's Los Angeles home, quickly soured. The meeting had been arranged by journalist and publicist Chris Hutchins, since the Beatles admired Elvis deeply. But tensions rose the moment Lennon stepped into Presley's mansion. The problem? Their political differences. Lennon was an outspoken pacifist and critic of the Vietnam War, while Presley was a staunch patriot. During the visit, Lennon noticed decorative wagon-shaped lamps engraved with the phrase, "All the way with Lyndon B. Johnson," a slogan tied to President Johnson's pro-war stance. Lennon wasted no time voicing his anti-war views, a move that irritated Presley, who strongly supported the U.S. government. Instead of a historic bond, the night ended in unease, with Elvis visibly annoyed at Lennon's outspokenness. Presley's dislike only grew stronger in the years that followed. He came to see Lennon, and the Beatles as a whole, as a negative influence on America's youth, accusing them of promoting rebellion, drugs, and anti-establishment attitudes. By 1971, Presley took his grievances to an extreme. He met with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, urging him to take action against Lennon. At the time, Lennon was already under government scrutiny for his anti-war activism and ongoing immigration struggles while trying to secure U.S. residency with Yoko Ono. To Elvis, Lennon represented not just a rival in music, but a genuine threat to American values. Presley's push against Lennon may have added weight to the growing pressure he faced from federal authorities. But Elvis wasn't the only star who harbored resentment. Bob Dylan, too, had his own complicated history with Lennon. In the Beatles' early years, Lennon was deeply inspired by Dylan's artistry. Dylan's raw, poetic lyrics and introspective storytelling stood in stark contrast to the Beatles' early catalog of catchy, straightforward love songs. Lennon, fascinated by Dylan's style, began weaving deeper personal reflections into his music, giving rise to classics like In My Life and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. But while Lennon admired Dylan, the feeling wasn't mutual. Dylan, fiercely protective of his originality, bristled at the idea that Lennon had borrowed too heavily from his work. To him, Lennon's artistic evolution seemed less like tribute and more like imitation. And by the mid-1960s, Dylan had already carved out his place as a countercultural icon. He wasn't eager to share that role with a band still viewed as polished pop idols. The tension surfaced most clearly in 1965, after the release of Rubber Soul. Songs like Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, carried a clear Dylan influence, with their acoustic sound and story-driven lyrics about love and betrayal. For Dylan, the resemblance felt uncomfortably close. A year later, Dylan fired back with Fourth Time Around, from his landmark album Blonde on Blonde. The song echoed Norwegian Wood so closely, in melody, structure, and theme, that it could only be read as a parody. But rather than romantic longing, Dylan's version was laced with sarcasm, detachment, and mockery. What made it sting even more was that Dylan reportedly played the song directly for Lennon. For once, the famously sharp-tongued Beatle was left unsettled. Lennon wasn't sure whether Dylan meant it as a joke or an outright insult. Though he never spoke openly about Fourth Time Around, those who knew him said he walked away rattled, realizing that the man he admired most in music didn't fully return that respect. By the early 1970s, John Lennon's Imagine had become both a cultural landmark and a lightning rod for criticism. To many, it was an anthem for peace and unity. But to others, its vision of a borderless, religion-free, possession-free world seemed naive, or worse, hypocritical. Among those critics were Steely Dan, the jazz rock duo of Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, famous for their razor-sharp cynicism. In 1972, they released Only a Fool Would Say That on their debut album Can't Buy a Thrill. While never directly naming Lennon, the target was clear. The song mocked the dreamer's call for utopia, suggesting that such ideals could only come from someone removed from reality. For Steely Dan, Lennon's preaching about equality and peace felt disingenuous when paired with his life of luxury. Living in a mansion, playing a Steinway grand, and enjoying all the privileges of rock stardom. The brilliance of their critique lay in its disguise. With a smooth, laid-back melody, the song almost sounded breezy, but underneath was biting sarcasm. The lyrics implied that only someone insulated by wealth and comfort could afford to believe in the fantasy Lennon was selling. Donald Fagen's cool, polished delivery only sharpened the sting. They weren't alone in their skepticism. Frank Zappa, another sharp-tongued icon of the era, also saw through what he considered Lennon's posturing. To Zappa, the peace slogans and activism were less about genuine change and more about maintaining relevance. Though the two briefly shared a stage in 1971, their differences were undeniable. Zappa's worldview was rooted in fierce individualism and a distrust of oversimplified answers to complex problems, qualities that clashed directly with Lennon's sweeping utopian calls. Frank Zappa's skepticism of countercultural heroes also extended to Lennon. To him, Lennon was an artist whose lofty rhetoric didn't always align with the way he lived. Lennon himself was aware of this contradiction. Even as Imagine became one of his signature works, he admitted in interviews that its message was aspirational rather than a reflection of his own life. He and Yoko Ono might have used their fame to promote peace, but they still lived surrounded by the privileges of wealth and success. Later, Lennon reflected on his role in the counterculture, acknowledging that he was just as flawed as anyone else, still trying to figure things out along the way. Another critic was Todd Rundgren. By the early 1970s, Rundgren was enjoying major success, with hits like Hello, It's Me and I Saw the Light establishing him as a pop visionary and studio innovator. While his music carried echoes of the Beatles' experimental influence, Rundgren was never one to lavish Lennon with praise. In fact, he was openly dismissive of Lennon's solo career and especially his public activism. As Lennon moved into a more politically charged phase with albums like Plastic Ono Band, 1970, and Imagine, 1971, he presented himself as both a deeply personal songwriter and a countercultural voice. Songs like Working Class Hero and Give Me Some Truth painted him as a revolutionary figure, while his partnership with Yoko Ono solidified his reputation as a global peace advocate. Yet Rundgren was unconvinced. In his eyes, Lennon's activism was less about genuine social change and more about keeping himself in the spotlight. In a blunt 1974 interview with Melody Maker, Rundgren argued that Lennon's politics were little more than performance. All he really wants to do is get attention for himself. And if revolution gets him that attention, he'll get attention through revolution. Todd Rundgren's harsh remarks painted Lennon as more of a publicity seeker than a genuine revolutionary, implying that his peace activism and political stances were nothing more than performance. Unsurprisingly, Lennon did not take this lightly. Known for his sharp tongue and unwillingness to back down, he issued a response that was both defensive and dismissive. In an open letter to Rundgren, Lennon pushed back against the accusations. "I don't represent anyone but myself," he wrote. "It sounds like I represented something to you, or you wouldn't be so violent towards me." His reply not only rejected Rundgren's claims, but also suggested that the criticism said more about Rundgren's personal resentment than about Lennon himself. This feud was more than just a clash of egos. It highlighted a larger debate in the music world over whether artists should use their fame as a platform for political causes. Lennon believed it was not only a right but a responsibility, while figures like Rundgren remained skeptical, especially when such activism came from stars as powerful and influential as the former Beatle. Another artist who clashed with Lennon was Joni Mitchell. Both were trailblazers of their era, reshaping the boundaries of modern music in their own ways. Mitchell, with her introspective poetry and soaring melodies, became a folk icon. Lennon, first as a Beatle and later as a solo artist, was one of the most recognizable cultural voices of his generation. Yet, despite their shared influence, their relationship was uneasy. Encounters between them carried a subtle tension, much of it fueled by Lennon's unsolicited critiques of Mitchell's work. By the early 1970s, Mitchell had already established herself as a singular force in music. Albums like Ladies of the Canyon, 1970, and Blue, 1971, redefined the possibilities of the singer-songwriter form, blending raw vulnerability with artistic sophistication. Blue in particular was hailed as groundbreaking, an intimate, unfiltered exploration of heartbreak, self-discovery, and the fragile complexities of love. Blue was a record unlike anything before it, a masterpiece that would go on to influence generations of artists, from Prince to Lana Del Rey to Taylor Swift. Lennon, meanwhile, had already charted his own post-Beatles course. By the time Mitchell released Blue in 1971, Lennon had unveiled Plastic Ono Band, 1970, and Imagine, 1971, works that revealed a raw, confrontational introspection. Yet, his approach lacked the fragile poetry and layered subtlety that defined Mitchell's songs. Both drew heavily from personal experience, but their songwriting styles diverged sharply. Mitchell crafted intricate, almost novelistic narratives, weaving imagery and emotional nuance into every line. Lennon's solo writing, by contrast, often favored blunt declarations and slogan-like simplicity. Their creative philosophies and strong personalities were bound to collide. The real spark came when Lennon, true to his reputation for bluntness, decided to offer Mitchell unsolicited advice about her music. She neither asked for it nor welcomed it. Though the exact words remain unknown, what Mitchell took from the exchange was condescension. Given Lennon's history of being tactless in his opinions, it's likely his remarks carried more sting than support. For Mitchell, fiercely independent and protective of her artistic vision, such comments were not easily brushed aside, especially from someone she believed didn't fully grasp her creative approach. Lennon's skepticism toward folk artists was well known. He often dismissed the introspective singer-songwriter movement as overly precious. That dismissiveness, paired with his sharp tongue, only deepened the rift between them. Mitchell later voiced her frustrations publicly, one of the few times she openly criticized another major artist. While much of the music world idolized Lennon, she looked beyond the legend and saw contradictions, flaws, perhaps even hypocrisy. For her, Lennon was not the untouchable icon so many revered, but simply another man whose words and actions did not always align. To Joni Mitchell, Lennon's activism and public persona often clashed with the reality of his actions, and she was unafraid to say so. Frank Zappa felt the same, though his issue with Lennon came not from ideology, but from what he considered outright theft. Their short-lived collaboration in 1971 ended not in harmony, but in controversy. Zappa, famous for his avant-garde rock experiments and no-nonsense bluntness, accused Lennon of crossing a line. The trouble began with what should have been a historic night. On June 6, 1971, during one of Zappa's Fillmore East concerts in New York, Lennon and Yoko Ono joined Zappa and the Mothers of Invention on stage. The result was a chaotic, free-form jam session that mixed Zappa's razor-sharp instrumentals with Lennon and Ono's improvisational vocals. One of the pieces performed that night was King Kong, a Zappa composition he had been playing since the late 60s. At the time, it all seemed friendly. Lennon, still exploring new musical directions after Imagine, was fascinated by the absurd, boundary-pushing energy of the session. Zappa welcomed him in, and the audience witnessed what looked like an exciting clash of two icons. But the goodwill collapsed a year later. In 1972, Lennon released Sometime in New York City, and included recordings from that Fillmore jam. Only now, King Kong appeared under a new title, Jamrag. Worse, Zappa wasn't credited as its composer. The writing was attributed solely to Lennon and Ono, as though it had been their creation all along. For Zappa, the matter was simple. It wasn't an oversight, it was theft. In later interviews, he was blunt. John just took the master tapes and put it out as if it were his own. Though he claimed no personal animosity toward Lennon, he dismissed the act as a really cheap thing to do. Zappa, who had built his career on uncompromising independence, saw this as more than a missing credit. His entire ethos centered on artistic integrity, resistance to industry manipulation, and respect for musicians' rights. For Lennon, an artist he might otherwise have admired, To take his work without acknowledgement felt like a profound betrayal. What made matters worse was Lennon's handling of the recording. On Sometime in New York City, the Fillmore Jam was remixed and heavily edited, draining it of the raw energy that defined the performance. Decades later, in 1992, Zappa answered back by releasing his own version on Playground Psychotics. His edition preserved the unaltered session and made one thing unmistakably clear: King Kong was his composition, not Lennon's.